When my phone rang that night, I almost didn't answer. It was late, the kind of late when silence feels heavier than sleep, when even the hum of the refrigerator sounds too loud. But the moment I saw my mother's name flash on the screen, my heart sank. Something in me already knew this wasn't going to be just another argument. "Rachel," she began, her voice tight, trembling, not with sadness, but with anger so sharp it could cut through glass. "Don't come back here. You're no longer welcome in this family." My name is Rachel Hayes, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a project manager at a tech company in Portland, Maine. Organized, responsible, the kind of daughter who always did everything right. But that night, none of it mattered. For a second, I thought she was joking. My fingers froze around the phone, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to laugh it off, but the silence that followed was colder than the night air seeping through my window. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I asked quietly. "What did I do?" "You embarrassed us, Rachel. You've forgotten what it means to be a Hayes. We can't have you ruining things for your brother. Stay away from us. Permanently." The words hit me so hard that I didn't even notice I was crying until a drop of water slid down onto the back of my hand. And then the line went dead. No explanation, no warning. Just the sound of finality, followed by the emptiness of a call ended by someone who used to love you. I stood in my apartment parking lot, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the wind whip through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, the world moving on while mine quietly collapsed. I looked up at the sky, heavy with clouds, dimly glowing from the city lights, and wondered how something as small as a phone call could unravel everything I thought I knew about family. You'd think, at 29, I'd be used to disappointment. But there's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't just ache, it hollows you out. The kind that leaves you staring into nothing, replaying every memory, every smile, every small kindness, and realizing it was more fragile than you ever imagined. And the worst part? I didn't even understand what I had done. That night, I walked aimlessly along the waterfront. The wind off the Atlantic was brutal, biting at my skin, but it couldn't compare to the cold that had settled somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't reach. I kept hearing her voice, sharp, final, cruel. "Stay away permanently." Was this really about the argument at my brother's engagement party? The one where I refused to downplay my career just to make him look more impressive? I'd been polite, careful even, but apparently, honesty was the one thing my mother couldn't forgive. It was strange how quickly love could turn into exile. When I got home, I sat by the window and stared out at the quiet street. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger's, someone who'd just been erased from her own story. I wanted to call her back. I wanted to apologize, even though I didn't know what for. But pride and pain kept me still. Instead, I scrolled through old photos, family vacations, birthdays, holidays, smiles that now felt staged, moments that suddenly seemed unreal. How do you process being disowned by the person who gave you life? There's no handbook for that. I left my phone face down on the table, the screen still glowing faintly, and whispered into the quiet, "I don't understand." But the only answer was the soft hum of the city outside. Sometimes, a single moment can split your life into before and after. That call was mine. Before, I was still the daughter who believed that if I worked hard enough, succeeded quietly enough, my family would one day see me for who I was. After, I was the woman they no longer claimed. And though I didn't know it yet, that moment, those 5 words, "You're no longer welcome here," would lead me straight into the kind of story I never could have imagined. A story about betrayal, redemption, and the one secret that would change everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's what keeps us going and helps us bring you more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one. Now, before we dive deeper, let me ask you something, because I want to know how you think. If you were in my place that night, what would you have done? A. Call your mother back immediately, desperate to fix things even if it meant apologizing for something you didn't do. B. Let the silence stand, even if it broke your heart, because sometimes walking away is the only way to protect your peace. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell me why. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, The lawn was always trimmed, the curtains always pressed, and the silverware always polished before dinner. To the neighbors, the Hayes family in Portland, Maine, was the picture of refinement. My mother, Elaine Hayes, made sure of that. She believed appearances weren't just important, they were everything. The way she saw it, reputation was a kind of currency, and she spent her life trying to make sure ours never lost its value. Inside, though, it felt like living in a glass museum, beautiful, fragile, and cold. Every smile had to be practiced, every conversation measured. We didn't talk about feelings, only about achievements, about how things looked. My mother's favorite phrase was, "Don't let people think less of us." I used to wonder who us really meant because it never felt like me. My brother Michael fit into that world effortlessly. From the time we were little, he was the golden boy, handsome, charming, and obedient. He knew how to mirror my mother's values perfectly, saying just the right things to earn her praise. He played soccer, got into the right college, dated the kind of women who came from families with country club memberships. Michael knew how to perform, and that performance kept him safe. I, on the other hand, was different. I was curious, restless, and stubborn in a quiet way that my mother found infuriating. I liked building things, solving problems, finding order in chaos. I wasn't the kind of daughter who cared about garden parties or designer dresses. I wanted to understand how things worked. The world, people, even the unspoken rules that seemed to govern our family. Elaine often told me I was too practical, as if that were a flaw. "You think like a worker, not like a lady," she'd say, frowning whenever I came home from school with dirt on my hands after helping in the robotics lab. "People will think you don't have class." It's strange how words can shape you without you noticing. For years, I tried to soften the parts of myself that didn't fit. My independence, my curiosity, my ambition. But the truth was, I was never meant to be the kind of woman my mother wanted me to become. I didn't crave approval. I craved purpose. My father, before he passed away when I was 19, was the only one who seemed to understand that. He used to tell me, "Rachel, your strength isn't something to hide. It's what will keep you standing when everything else falls apart." He said it like a prophecy, and I didn't realize how right he was until much later. After college, while most of my friends were still figuring out what they wanted, I dove headfirst into the corporate world. I started as a junior project coordinator at a tech firm, the youngest in the department. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the kind of job my mother could boast about at her charity luncheons. But I loved it. The deadlines, the problem solving, the quiet sense of accomplishment that came from building something that worked. Elaine hated it. "A factory job?" She scoffed the first time I told her what I did. "Why would a girl with your education choose something so mechanical?" I tried to explain that I wasn't working in a factory, that I was managing operations for automation systems used by large companies, but she didn't care about the details. All she heard was that I wasn't following the script. To her, success meant marrying well, keeping up appearances, being admired. To me, it meant standing on my own 2 feet. That difference between us became a quiet war, one that played out in sighs, in raised eyebrows, in comments meant to sting, but disguised as concern. She'd introduce me at parties as, "My daughter Rachel. She works with machines or something." I used to smile politely while my stomach twisted in knots. Still, part of me hoped that one day she'd see me differently. I thought if I worked hard enough, earned enough, she'd finally look at me with pride instead of pity. But the more successful I became, the wider the gap between us grew. My promotions, my salary, my independence. They didn't impress her. They threatened her idea of what our family was supposed to be. Michael, of course, never had that problem. He followed her blueprint perfectly. Even when he struggled, she spun his failures into excuses. "He's just finding himself," she'd say with a smile, while reminding me to stop making everything about work. When my father died, Elaine's obsession with control only deepened. She became the kind of woman who hosted charity events not out of generosity, but out of fear. Fear of fading, of being ordinary, of losing her social standing. And Michael became her mirror, reflecting everything she wanted to believe about our family. I became the reminder of what she couldn't control. I remember once, after I bought my first car outright, she said, "You could have asked me for help." It's unbecoming for a woman to handle such things on her own. I wanted to laugh, but there was no humor in it. That was the world she lived in, a place where independence was rebellion and silence was survival. For years, I played along. I came home for holidays, smiled through the discomfort, pretended not to notice the way she looked at me when I talked about work. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Every visit left me feeling smaller, like I was shrinking to fit back into the version of me she could tolerate. Sometimes, when I'd drive back to Portland after another tense family dinner, I'd find myself gripping the steering wheel and whispering, "You'll never be enough for her." It wasn't self-pity. It was just truth. But even then, even knowing that, I still loved her. Maybe that's the cruelest part of family. You keep trying, even when it hurts. You keep reaching for warmth from people who've only ever given you frost. When I look back now, I can see the patterns more clearly. Elaine wasn't cruel out of hatred. She was terrified. Terrified of being ordinary, of losing control, of being seen as anything less than perfect. Her obsession with appearances wasn't vanity. It was armor. And Michael, for all his charm, wasn't as free as I once thought. He was trapped too, just in a different kind of cage, one lined with expectation instead of disapproval. I was the only one who ever tried to break out, and for that, I became the family's quiet shame. By the time I turned 29, I had stopped waiting for their approval. I told myself I didn't need it. I had my own apartment overlooking the harbor, a job that challenged me, friends who felt like family. I was proud of the life I'd built. But deep down, there was still a part of me that wanted my mother to see me, not the version she'd invented, but the real me. The woman who had learned how to stand on her own without losing her softness. And that's what made her call, the one that shattered everything, cut so deeply. Because no matter how far I'd come, some part of me was still that little girl waiting for her mother to say, "I'm proud of you." Only now I realized she never would have, not until everything she believed about us came crashing down. The night of my brother's engagement party was supposed to be one of those evenings you remember for all the right reasons. The kind you look back on years later with warmth and laughter. For my mother, Elaine Hayes, it was her chance to prove, once again, that the Hayes family was as flawless as the world believed. The invitations had been printed on heavy cream cardstock. The florist delivered hundreds of white lilies. The caterers wore black ties. And the music, of course, was live. Nothing about that night was accidental. Every detail had been arranged by Elaine herself, down to the placement of the champagne glasses and the shade of gold on the table runners. When I arrived, the house looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. My mother greeted me at the door with the kind of tight-lipped smile that said behave. She looked impeccable, her silver hair pulled into a neat twist, her diamond earrings glinting under the chandelier. Beside her stood my brother Michael, glowing with the ease of someone who had always been the family favorite. His fiancée, Lena, was the kind of woman who made other people nervous to breathe too loudly around her, graceful, poised, radiating effortless charm. "Rachel, darling," my mother said, pressing a cool kiss to my cheek. "Try to smile more tonight. This is an important evening for Michael and Lena." That was her way of reminding me not to draw attention to myself. I nodded and stepped into the living room, where laughter and conversation hummed like static. The room was filled with people from Portland's upper circle, investors, business owners, and the kind of people who used networking as a verb. I'd never felt comfortable in these settings. They were my mother's natural habitat, not mine. But that night, I made an effort. I complimented the food, smiled at guests I barely knew, even helped refill wine glasses when the servers were busy. I thought, for once, maybe we'd get through the evening without Elaine finding something to criticize. That hope lasted until dinner. We were seated at a long mahogany table draped with a lace runner. My mother was at the head, naturally, Michael and Lena beside her. I sat across from Lena's parents, Richard and Carol Whitmore, who were polite in the way wealthy people are when they're assessing whether you belong in their world. "So, Rachel," Carol said, smiling over her glass of Pinot Noir. "Your mother tells us you work in technology?" I nodded, setting down my fork. "Yes, I'm a project manager at a tech company here in Portland. We focus on industrial automation systems." Oh, fascinating, Richard said, leaning forward. You must be doing quite well in that field. It's booming, isn't it? I smiled. It is. I've been with the company for 7 years now, and I recently started leading our international accounts. It's been challenging but rewarding. It was an innocent enough answer. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I saw my mother's expression tighten, her hand pausing midair as she reached for her wine. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and warning. I knew that look. It meant stop talking. Richard nodded approvingly. Impressive. Sounds like you've built a solid career. I've been lucky, I said, but it's mostly hard work. The conversation moved on, but I could feel my mother's gaze burning into me. Her smile was still plastered on for the guests, but her jaw was tense. I had disrupted the script. I wasn't supposed to sound successful. I was supposed to sound safe, modest, invisible. When dinner ended, Elaine caught my arm as I passed her in the hallway. Rachel, she hissed quietly, the smile still on her face for appearances. Do you have to brag about your job? You made Lena's parents uncomfortable. Brag? I repeated, stunned. Mom, I just answered a question. They asked what I do. Her eyes narrowed. You could have said something simple. Something like you work in an office. You don't need to go on about international accounts and leadership. It sounds arrogant. Or maybe, I said softly, it just sounds like I'm proud of what I've earned. Don't start, she said through clenched teeth. You know how sensitive this family's reputation is. You make Michael look bad when you talk like that. There it was, the truth laid bare in a single sentence. It wasn't about me at all. It was about maintaining the illusion. My mother had spent decades crafting an image of the Hayes family as graceful and perfectly balanced. Michael's engagement was supposed to be another jewel in her crown. My success didn't fit her narrative. It made the edges uneven. I didn't realize honesty was embarrassing, I said quietly. She leaned in, her voice low but sharp. You never realize, Rachel. That's the problem. You don't understand how people see things, how they see us. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had built her life around the approval of others, and for the first time, I felt something different. Not anger, not disappointment, pity, because I understood finally that she wasn't protecting the family. She was protecting her image of it. The rest of the evening blurred together. Guests congratulated Michael, laughter filled the room again, and I played my part, smiling, clinking glasses, pretending everything was fine. But inside, something had shifted. There was a finality to that conversation, like a door quietly closing between us. When I was leaving, I found my mother in the foyer, saying goodbye to guests. Good night, Mom, I said softly. She didn't look at me. Drive safe, she said, her voice distant. I stood there for a moment, waiting for her to meet my eyes. She didn't. So I turned and walked out. Outside, the night air was cold and damp. I stood in the driveway for a moment, watching through the window as she laughed with Lena's parents. Her hand rested proudly on Michael's arm, her face glowing with approval. The picture-perfect family, minus the daughter who never quite belonged. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head. You make Michael look bad when you talk like that. By the time I got home, the sting had turned to something else. Not rage exactly, but a kind of weary clarity. I realized I'd spent my entire life trying to fit into a frame that was never meant for me, and no amount of success or kindness or compliance would ever make me enough for a woman who valued appearances over authenticity. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that this quiet confrontation would be the last thread holding our fragile family together. Within 3 days, she would call me again. Not to apologize, not to talk things through, but to sever whatever bond was left between us. That night, though, I didn't know any of that. I just sat in the driver's seat, staring at my own reflection in the windshield, and whispered the question that had haunted me since childhood. What did I do wrong this time? The answer, I would learn later, wasn't in what I did, but in who I refused to be. 3 days after my mother's call, the silence in my apartment began to feel like a living thing. It followed me from room to room, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I kept checking my phone, half expecting her to text, even something cruel, even a demand to return the key to her house. But there was nothing, just stillness. I tried to throw myself into work, to bury the ache under spreadsheets and project deadlines, but even that couldn't drown out the hollow echo of her last words. That Tuesday evening, I was sitting at my kitchen table, eating dinner alone, when a message appeared on my phone. The number wasn't saved. The text read, open quote, Miss Hayes, this is Nathan Cole from Horizon Capital Management. Please contact me as soon as possible regarding urgent family financial matters. Close quote. At first, I thought it was spam. My mother had just disowned me. What possible family matters could there be? Still, something about the wording, professional, cautious, not the tone of a scammer, made me hesitate. I reread the message several times before curiosity got the better of me. When I called, a man's calm voice answered. Nathan Cole speaking. This is Rachel Hayes, I said carefully. You sent me a text about family financial matters? Yes, he replied, sounding relieved. Thank you for returning my call. I've been trying to reach your mother, Mrs. Elaine Hayes, for several weeks with no success. She's not returning messages, and her accounts have reached a point where immediate attention is required. Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. I'm not involved in my mother's finances. We're not exactly speaking. That's what's puzzling, he said. You're listed as the emergency contact and primary beneficiary for both her and your brother's investment accounts. Legally, you have the authority to be notified in matters of financial distress. I gripped the edge of the table. Beneficiary? That can't be right. I assure you, Miss Hayes, the documentation is clear. You were added approximately 18 months ago. I really need to discuss this in person. There are some urgent issues you should be aware of. His voice carried something that wasn't quite fear, but it wasn't calm either. It was the sound of someone preparing to deliver bad news. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him the next morning. Sleep was impossible that night. My mind spun with possibilities. Had my mother invested in something risky? Was this some elaborate trick to get me involved again? To make me feel guilty? By the time dawn crept over Portland, I'd convinced myself it was some minor misunderstanding, something that could be cleared up in 10 minutes. Horizon Capital's office was located in one of those modern glass buildings downtown, the kind that gleams in the sunlight and smells faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. Nathan Cole was waiting for me in the lobby. He was in his 50s, his gray suit neat but not flashy, his demeanor soft-spoken. He smiled when he saw me, though there was no warmth in it, only sympathy. Miss Hayes, he said, extending his hand, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, come with me. His office was tidy and understated, the kind of space that gave the illusion of control. He offered me coffee, which I declined. Then he opened a thick folder on his desk and began spreading out documents, bank statements, account summaries, letters from creditors. My name was printed on several of them. I'm afraid what I'm about to show you is rather serious, he said quietly. Your mother and brother have made some unfortunate financial decisions. I leaned forward, my stomach tightening. What kind of decisions? He sighed. Over the past 2 years, they've liquidated most of their retirement accounts and taken out multiple loans against your mother's home. That money was invested in a firm called Grandview Real Estate Partners. I frowned. I've never heard of them. You wouldn't have, he said. They were shut down last month by federal investigators. It was a Ponzi scheme. The words didn't make sense at first. They just sat there, heavy and unreal. How much are we talking about? Nathan hesitated before answering. Approximately $500,000. I felt the air leave my lungs. $500,000? Yes. Your mother mortgaged the property to its full value and used the proceeds to increase their investment. Your brother contributed his savings and his fiancée's as well. When the firm collapsed, all of it vanished. I tried to process what he was saying, but the numbers blurred together. $500,000. My mother, the woman who'd built her identity on control and reputation, had fallen for a scam. My brother, who was always careful with money, or so I thought, had gone along with it. Nathan pushed a few more papers toward me. These are the most recent notices. The mortgage payments are behind. The bank has initiated preliminary foreclosure warnings. Credit card debt has accumulated rapidly. If the situation isn't addressed soon, the house may be lost within 60 days. I stared at the documents, the lines of text swimming before my eyes. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock on his wall. Why would she list me as a beneficiary? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She just told me she never wanted to see me again. I can't answer that, Nathan said gently. But the paperwork was filed long before this current estrangement. Your father's original estate plan included you as the most financially responsible member of the family. When your mother updated her documents after his passing, she maintained that structure. It may be that she simply never changed it. I let out a shaky breath. So legally I can step in? You can. In fact, I'd strongly recommend it. He explained the situation in detail, the overdue payments, the calls from creditors, the possibility of negotiating temporary relief if someone intervened soon. The more he spoke, the more surreal it felt. Just days ago, I'd been cast out like a family disgrace. Now, apparently, I was the only person who could keep them from losing everything. When I left the office, the sky had turned gray, and the streets of Portland felt strangely distant, like I was walking through someone else's life. I found myself at the edge of the waterfront, staring at the cold, restless water. My reflection rippled on the surface, distorted by the wind. The irony of it all struck me hard. My mother had spent her entire life guarding the illusion of perfection. Every dinner party, every charity event, every carefully arranged photograph. And yet, behind the curtains of her perfect house, she had built her own ruin. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to think she deserves this after the way she'd spoken to me. But I couldn't, because beneath the pride and the resentment, she was still my mother. And no matter how much I tried to hate her, I couldn't stop caring. As I stood there watching the tide pull against the rocks, I felt a strange certainty settle over me. This wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. The call that had shattered me a week ago wasn't the closing of a door. It was the crack that revealed what was rotting beneath the surface. I didn't know what I would do yet, or how deeply this mess would pull me in, but one thing was clear. I was going to have to walk back into the very world that had cast me out. Not out of forgiveness. Not yet, but out of duty. And maybe, if I was honest with myself, out of something like love. The morning after meeting Nathan Cole, I drove through the quiet streets of Portland with a knot in my stomach and a folder full of financial documents on the passenger seat. The sky was low and gray, the kind of overcast that made everything look washed out, like the world was holding its breath. I hadn't been to my mother's house since the night of Michael's engagement party, and as I turned into her street, I almost laughed at how perfect everything still looked. The rose bushes were trimmed, the shutters newly painted, and the mailbox gleamed in the early light. From the outside, it was the same house I grew up in, an image frozen in time. But I knew the truth now. Beneath the polished surface was collapse. I parked at the curb, sat there for a moment, and watched the curtains in the living room shift. Someone was home. I took a deep breath, grabbed the folder, and walked up the front steps. My hand hesitated at the doorbell. Part of me expected her to ignore it, to pretend she wasn't there. But after a few seconds, the door opened a crack. Rachel? It was Michael. His voice was thin, uncertain. He looked older somehow. The confident smile I remembered from the party was gone, replaced by a kind of wary exhaustion. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt. "Hi," I said quietly. "We need to talk." He opened the door wider but didn't meet my eyes. "Mom's not feeling well. I'm not here for small talk." I held up the folder. "Nathan Cole called me." At the mention of the name, his shoulders slumped. He stepped aside without another word, letting me in. The moment I crossed the threshold, the memories hit me. Every dinner, every holiday, every fight. But they felt distant, like someone else's life. The house smelled different now, faintly stale, as if the air hadn't been freshened in weeks. The living room was half empty. Several pieces of furniture were missing. The ornate rug that used to stretch across the floor was gone, leaving a rectangle of faded carpet. "Where's all the furniture?" I asked. Michael rubbed his temple. "We had to sell some things. Just temporary. Mom said it was better than taking another loan." I bit back the urge to say what I was thinking. Instead, I asked, "Is she here?" He nodded toward the hallway. "In her room." I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow space. The door to her bedroom was slightly open. I knocked once before pushing it gently. Elaine Hayes sat by the window, her back to me, still wearing her trademark pearls over a soft gray sweater. But she looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched, her hair untidy. When she turned, her eyes widened in shock. "I told you not to come here," she said, her voice hoarse. "And yet, here I am," I replied. I set the folder down on her vanity, my hands trembling slightly. "Nathan told me everything. The investments, the loans, the house." She turned away, staring out the window. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." "I didn't have a choice. My name is on your paperwork." Her silence stretched, heavy and brittle. When she finally spoke, her tone cracked under the weight of it. "We were supposed to double our money. Michael said it was safe. Everyone said it was safe." I looked around the room, at the designer handbags stacked in the corner, the jewelry box still open on the dresser. "You mortgaged your home for a fantasy," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "You risked everything. For what? To impress people who don't even care?" "Don't you dare lecture me," she snapped, turning toward me. "You don't understand what it's like to build something from nothing, to maintain respect, to pretend," I interrupted. "That's what you built, Mom. A facade. And now it's gone." For a moment, she just stared at me, eyes wet and furious. "You think you're better than me," she said. "You've always thought that." "No," I said softly. "I just stopped pretending I was less." Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she looked scared. Not of me, but of what she'd done. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the bed. Foreclosure warnings, bank statements, the report from Horizon Capital. Michael appeared in the doorway, pale and silent. "Mom," I said, "you're 3 payments behind on the mortgage. You owe close to $500,000. If we don't act now, you'll lose the house." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "There has to be a way to fix this." "There is," I said, "but not the way you're used to. You can't buy your way out of this. You can't charm your way out either." Michael stepped forward. "Rachel, we didn't mean for this to happen. We thought—" "You thought you were smarter than everyone else," I cut in. "That's what this family does. We pretend we're untouchable, but look where that's gotten us." The words hung there, raw and unforgiving. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Elaine sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "I don't know how to start over," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life trying to be someone people admire, and now I can't even look at myself." I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was an ache so deep it made my throat tighten. I sat beside her. "Mom, you don't have to be admired. You just have to be honest. That's what people respect." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Honesty doesn't keep a roof over your head." "No," I said, "but lies don't either." We sat there in silence for a long time. The air between us was thick with all the things we'd never said, the apologies that never came, the years of quiet resentment. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, fragile. "What happens now?" I looked at the documents spread out before us. "Now we face it, the debt, the calls, the truth, all of it." Michael leaned against the doorframe. "And if we can't?" "Then you lose everything," I said. "Unless someone steps in." My mother looked at me sharply. "You?" "I didn't say that," I replied, though part of me knew that's exactly what would happen. "But I can't even think about helping until we stop pretending this is someone else's fault." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're so much like your father," she said quietly. "He would have done the same, walked in here and told me the truth I didn't want to hear." "I'm not here to save you," I said. "I'm here to make sure you understand what you've done." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. There was still a part of me, the child who once waited for her mother's approval, that wanted to protect her. Elaine nodded slowly, as if accepting something she'd been fighting for too long. "I never thought it would be you," she murmured, "the one who would hold us together." I stood and gathered the papers back into the folder. Neither did I. When I left the house, the sky had started to clear, a faint strip of blue breaking through the gray. I paused on the front porch and looked back through the window. My mother sat motionless on the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, her pearls catching the weak light. Michael stood behind her, a shadow of the confident man he used to be. For the first time, I saw them not as the people who had hurt me, but as 2 frightened souls who had built their lives on illusion and were now standing in its ruins. I walked to my car feeling both heavy and strangely calm. I didn't know what the next step would be, whether I could forgive them or even if I wanted to. But one thing was certain. The truth, no matter how painful, had finally found its way into that house. And nothing, not the roses, not the polished floors, not even Elaine Hayes herself, could hide from it anymore. The days after that confrontation blurred into a kind of exhausted quiet. I'd spent so many years standing on the outside of that family, and now, suddenly, I was at its center. Not because they had welcomed me back, but because they had no one else. Every call, every email, every bill in that thick folder Nathan Cole gave me pointed to one truth. If I didn't act, the house would be gone within weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, the daughter who'd been told to stay away permanently, was now the only one capable of saving them. But it wasn't just about saving a house or bank accounts anymore. It was about pulling my mother and brother out of the wreckage they had built and forcing them, maybe for the first time, to face what they'd become. The first thing I did was take control of the numbers. I called Nathan, set up a meeting, and went through every line of debt: mortgages, credit cards, personal loans, even a handful of high-interest accounts my brother had opened without telling anyone. I asked him to transfer every statement to me. From that moment on, nothing in the Hayes family's finances moved without my knowledge. Nathan didn't question it. He only nodded and said, "It's good to see someone taking responsibility." Responsibility. The word stung, because it implied I'd inherited it rather than chosen it. Still, I leaned into it. When I went back to the house that weekend, Elaine and Michael were sitting in the kitchen. The place was spotless again, as if cleaning could erase the shame that hung in the air. I set my laptop on the table and opened a spreadsheet. "We're going to do this properly," I said. "If you want me to help, there are going to be rules." Elaine's mouth tightened. "Rules?" "Yes," I said. "No spending without approval. No pretending things are fine. You will both know exactly where every dollar goes. And every Sunday, we'll sit down and review the week." Michael frowned. "You make it sound like we're children." "Then stop acting like ones," I replied. For a moment, no one spoke. I could feel the resentment in the room thick as fog, but I didn't back down. I'd spent my life tiptoeing around their egos, keeping the peace, and it had gotten us nowhere. This time I was leading, and they could either follow or lose everything. To my surprise, Elaine didn't argue. She just nodded slowly and said, "Fine, if this is what it takes." That first week was brutal. I canceled credit cards, called creditors, and arranged payment deferrals. I set up automatic transfers so no one could conveniently forget to pay the mortgage. And when I found out my mother was still donating to one of her social clubs, I cut it off immediately. "You had no right," she said when she found out. "I have every right," I answered. "You lost that when you mortgaged your future for appearances." We didn't speak for 2 days after that. But on the third night, she knocked on my apartment door, holding a stack of unopened envelopes. "I can't keep up with these," she said. "Show me how." That was the first time she'd asked for my help without a trace of pride in her voice. It wasn't victory I felt. It was relief. I spent the next few weeks rebuilding their lives the way I'd rebuild a failing project at work. Structure first, then accountability, then progress. I made charts. I color-coded priorities. I turned their chaos into something I could measure, because that was the only way I knew how to make sense of it. But numbers were the easy part. The hard part was changing habits. Elaine was addicted to appearances, in the same way some people are addicted to alcohol. It was her way of numbing pain. Every time she felt insecure, she bought something, hosted something, gave something away. I had to cut off her supply. When I found she'd ordered an expensive skincare set online, I canceled the order and replaced it with drugstore brands. When she complained, I told her, "You can't buy your way out of guilt." Michael, on the other hand, was all avoidance. He wanted to fix things, but only if he didn't have to face how bad they were. I made him call the bank himself to confirm the status of the loans. He cried halfway through the conversation, then didn't speak to me for 2 days. But after that, he stopped pretending ignorance. Slowly, painfully, the house began to shift. The tension softened. Meals became simpler. No more catered dinners, just whatever we cooked ourselves. Elaine started baking again, something she hadn't done since before my father died. One night, as she took a tray of muffins from the oven, she said quietly, "Your father used to say I made the best blueberry ones." "I remember," I said. She smiled, small and tired. "He'd be proud of you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. By the end of the month, I realized we needed more than budgets. We needed healing. So I started something new. Every Sunday evening after the financial review, we'd stay at the table and talk. No judgment, no pretending. I called it Honesty Hour. At first, it was awkward. Elaine would talk about her garden, Michael about his work search, and no one would touch the truth. But eventually, honesty began to take root. One night, I admitted that I had been terrified of becoming like them, trapped by pride. Michael confessed that he'd gone along with the investment because he wanted to impress our mother, to prove he could be her favorite. Elaine stayed quiet for a long time, then said, "I wanted so badly for people to see us as perfect that I stopped seeing who we really were." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. Outside of the family, I found myself craving a sense of purpose that went beyond crisis management. I started writing about what we were going through, not mentioning names, just stories about financial control and emotional recovery. I posted them anonymously on a women's forum. To my surprise, people responded. Dozens of messages came in from women who'd been through similar things. Daughters cleaning up their parents' messes, wives trying to rebuild trust, women who'd been told their worth depended on how they appeared. Reading their words reminded me I wasn't alone. For the first time, my pain became something useful. Months passed, and progress, though slow, was steady. We reduced the mortgage debt, set up realistic budgets, and even managed to create small savings accounts for emergencies. The constant tension that had once filled every room began to lift. But taking control wasn't just about managing money. It was about rewriting the family dynamic. For years, Elaine had been the sun we orbited around, her approval the light we all chased. Now, the balance had shifted. When she wanted to make a purchase, she came to me first. When Michael got a new job offer, he asked for my opinion before accepting. It was strange, empowering, but also unsettling. I'd become the anchor of a family that once saw me as a threat. One evening, after we finished dinner, Elaine looked across the table at me and said, "You've become the glue holding us together." I smiled faintly. "No, Mom, you were just afraid to admit I always was." She didn't argue. She just reached for her cup of tea, her hand trembling slightly, and said, "Maybe you're right." Driving home that night, I realized control didn't feel like power. It felt like peace. I hadn't fixed everything. I hadn't erased the hurt. But I'd built something new out of the wreckage. A fragile honesty that held us up, even when forgiveness still felt far away. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the outcast of the Hayes family. I felt like its anchor, quiet, steady, unshakable. Change didn't come in a single moment. It didn't arrive like lightning or revelation. It came quietly, in the slow rhythm of daily effort. The kind of change that only becomes visible when you look back and realize you're no longer standing in the same place. For the first time in years, the Hayes family wasn't defined by perfection or shame. We were defined by work. It started with necessity. When I sat down with Elaine and Michael one cold Monday morning, I told them the truth they'd been avoiding. No amount of budgeting could save them unless they learned to earn again. My mother flinched when I said the word job, as if it were something shameful. "I haven't worked in 30 years, she whispered. "What could I possibly do now?" "Anything," I said gently. "Something honest, something that makes you proud for the right reasons." Michael was easier to convince. He'd been restless since the scandal broke, tired of waiting for things to get better. He found a position at a logistics company after a few weeks of searching, an entry-level job with a modest salary but real stability. When he got the offer, he looked both relieved and terrified. "I don't even know if I remember how to be an employee," he said. "You'll learn," I told him. "You just have to show up." For Elaine, showing up meant swallowing her pride. The day she told me she'd taken a part-time job at a small floral shop downtown, her voice trembled between embarrassment and defiance. "Don't you dare tell anyone," she said. "I don't need your sympathy." "I'm not offering sympathy," I replied. "I'm offering respect." And in truth, I meant it. Watching her dress in simple clothes, tie her hair back, and walk out the door every morning felt surreal. This was the same woman who once spent hours arranging centerpieces for charity galas, now arranging bouquets for customers who didn't know her name. But there was something pure about it, something cleansing. The first few weeks were rough. Elaine came home exhausted, her feet aching, her hands covered in tiny cuts from the stems. She complained constantly. "People are rude," she said one night, dropping her purse on the counter. "Do you know what it's like to have someone snap their fingers at you because you forgot a ribbon?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I know exactly what that feels like." She looked at me for a long time after that, and for once there was no argument in her eyes, just understanding. Michael's adjustment was its own kind of reckoning. He'd gone from being the charming golden child to just another employee under fluorescent lights. One night, he called me after work, his voice cracking. "Rach, I had to clean up a shipment mistake I didn't even make," he said. "The supervisor yelled at me in front of everyone." "How did you handle it?" I asked. "I fixed it," he said after a pause. "And then I went back to work." I smiled into the phone. "Then you're doing just fine." He didn't say it, but I could hear something new in his tone. Humility, maybe, or just the quiet realization that life doesn't owe him ease. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the changes began to show. The house no longer felt suffocating. Elaine stopped attending the few social events she was still invited to. Instead, she spent her weekends in the garden, coaxing life out of soil that had once been purely decorative. She began bringing home small bouquets she couldn't sell, leftovers, she called them, and placing them around the house. One afternoon, she handed me a vase of wildflowers. "These are from the shop," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "They're not perfect, but I like them better that way." That was the closest she had ever come to admitting that perfection had cost her too much. I noticed it too in the way she treated other people. When the mailman came by, she offered him lemonade. When a neighbor's car battery died, she helped call for a jump. Small gestures, yes, but for a woman who once measured worth in status, they were nothing short of revolutionary. Michael found meaning in his new work, too. He wasn't climbing any ladders, but for the first time, he seemed grounded. "I like earning my own paycheck," he told me one evening. "It's small, but it's mine." "Money feels different when you've worked for it," I said. He nodded. "I didn't get that before. Mom never taught us that." "She didn't know how," I said. "She thought love meant giving, not teaching." There were still moments of tension, of course. Old habits are stubborn. Some nights, Elaine would slip into her old patterns, complaining about the kind of people she had to deal with at work, or comparing herself to her former friends who still hosted fundraisers. But then she'd catch herself, sigh, and change the subject. Progress isn't linear. It's the sum of small corrections. Through all of this, I found my own transformation unfolding quietly alongside theirs. I had started teaching financial literacy workshops at a community center on weekends. It wasn't something I planned. It just happened after I shared my story, anonymously at first, online. The messages I received were overwhelming. Women who'd been dismissed, women who'd been the responsible one, women who carried their families on their backs without acknowledgement. Every story reminded me that what I had gone through wasn't rare. It was simply hidden. Standing in front of those groups each week, watching women's faces light up as they learned how to manage debt or track spending, I realized that control didn't have to mean rigidity. It could mean freedom, the ability to face reality without fear. That was something my mother never had, but maybe I could pass it forward. By late spring, the Hayes family looked nothing like it once had. The mortgage was current, the debts were slowly shrinking. The laughter that had once sounded forced began to sound real. The house, stripped of its old grandeur, felt lighter, more human. One evening, I stopped by the floral shop after work. Through the window, I saw my mother helping an older woman choose flowers. She was smiling, not the tight, practiced smile I grew up with, but something genuine. When she noticed me, she didn't look embarrassed. She just waved. It took me a second to wave back because in that moment I understood she wasn't ashamed anymore. That night over dinner, she said something that caught me off guard. "I used to think I raised you wrong," she said, stirring her tea, "that you were too independent, too cold. But now I think I was just scared. You were strong in ways I didn't understand." I swallowed hard. "You weren't wrong, Mom. You were just lost in a world that rewarded pretending. She nodded, her eyes glistening. Maybe, but you didn't pretend, and look where it's brought us. Her words lingered with me long after she went to bed. For years I had believed that survival meant cutting ties, that forgiveness was weakness. But as I looked around at this new, quieter version of our family, I realized forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about rebuilding with open eyes. And in rebuilding them, I had rebuilt myself. Pride had broken us. Work had humbled us. But humility, honest, unvarnished humility, had finally made us a family again. A full year had passed since the night my mother told me I was no longer welcome. 12 months that felt both impossibly long and startlingly brief. The seasons had turned over like pages, carrying us from the wreckage of our old life into something steadier, quieter, real. The house on Willow Street no longer gleamed the way it once did. The paint on the shutters was beginning to chip, and the front lawn wasn't perfectly trimmed anymore. But for the first time, it felt alive. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and baked bread instead of perfume and expensive polish. The silence that had once felt suffocating now carried the hum of something warmer. Laughter, conversation, the soft clatter of ordinary life. It wasn't perfect, and that was what made it beautiful. That Thanksgiving, I arrived early, carrying 2 pumpkin pies I'd baked that morning. The kitchen was already bustling. My mother, Elaine, stood by the stove, her hair tied back, wearing an apron that had a faded floral print. Michael was setting the table, humming under his breath to a song I didn't recognize. When I stepped inside, they both looked up. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an intruder. "Smells good in here," I said, setting the pies down on the counter. Elaine smiled, her face soft with something that looked a lot like peace. "I didn't burn the turkey this time," she said with mock pride. "Progress," I teased, and she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and warm. Dinner was simple. There were no crystal glasses, no linen napkins, no guests to impress. Just us, sitting around a wooden table with mismatched plates and food made by our own hands. When we bowed our heads to say grace, I noticed that Elaine's voice trembled. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. After we ate, we stayed at the table long after the plates were empty, letting the conversation drift. Michael talked about work, how he'd been promoted to team lead. Elaine mentioned the flower shop and the woman she worked for who had become a friend. And then, unexpectedly, she looked at me. "Rachel," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I owe you an apology." I froze. She had said sorry in small ways before, in gestures, in changed behavior, but never outright. "I was cruel to you," she continued. "For years, I let my fear dictate everything I did. Fear of losing status, fear of being judged, fear that if I wasn't perfect, people would see how ordinary I really was. I thought if I could control you, I could control that fear, but I only ended up losing you." The words landed softly but powerfully. The woman sitting before me wasn't the version of my mother who once measured love in appearances. She was human now, flawed and unguarded. "I forgive you," I said simply. Her eyes glistened. "You shouldn't. You had every right to hate me." "I don't hate you, Mom," I said. "I just needed you to see me. Not the daughter you wanted, but the woman I became." She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly, and I took it. It felt fragile, but real. "I see you now," she whispered. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the heavy quiet. "Well," he said, grinning, "if we're doing family therapy at the dinner table, I'd like to confess that I may have accidentally killed the houseplants." Elaine gasped. "The ferns?" "Both," he admitted. In my defense, they looked fine until they didn't. We laughed until tears ran down our faces, the tension dissolving in the way only laughter can. Later, after the dishes were done, I stood outside on the porch with a cup of coffee. The air was cool and sharp, the sky full of stars. My mother joined me a few minutes later, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "It feels different, doesn't it?" she said. "It does," I replied. "I used to think strength meant pretending everything was fine," she said. "But watching you this past year, I understand now that strength is about facing things head on. You didn't run from the truth, Rachel. You forced us to see it." I looked at her profile in the soft porch light. There were lines around her eyes I hadn't noticed before, but they suited her. They made her look real. "You're stronger than you think, Mom," I said. "You always were. You just didn't know it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, But I think you inherited the best parts of both your father and me. The heart from him, the stubbornness from me. You saved this family." "I didn't save it," I said. "I just stopped letting it fall apart." For a moment, we stood there in silence, listening to the faint sound of Michael washing dishes inside. It struck me how strange it was that something as devastating as a financial collapse could become the thing that healed us. If it hadn't all fallen apart, we might never have seen each other clearly. When I drove home that night, the roads were nearly empty. The lights of Portland glimmered in the distance, reflected in the bay like scattered coins. I thought about who I used to be, the woman who once stood crying in a parking lot, clutching her phone after being told she was no longer welcome. That version of me had been broken open, stripped of illusions, but in that breaking, I discovered a kind of freedom I never expected. Respect wasn't something that could be given or demanded. It had to be earned, moment by moment, through honesty, integrity, and the courage to start again. In the months that followed, our relationship continued to evolve. I stopped being the manager of their lives and became something else, a partner, a guide when needed, a daughter who could finally stand as an equal. My mother still worked at the flower shop. She'd sometimes bring home leftover blooms, and when she did, she'd say, "For the woman who taught me that beauty doesn't have to be expensive." Michael thrived in his new role at work. He'd started mentoring younger employees, teaching them patience and responsibility, the very lessons he had learned the hard way. He once joked, "Turns out humility looks good on me." As for me, I kept teaching financial literacy workshops, and I began to share more of my story publicly. At first, it was terrifying, exposing something so personal. But every time someone reached out to say, "That's my story too," I felt a sense of connection that went beyond my own healing. I wasn't just telling a story of loss and recovery anymore. I was telling one of growth, resilience, and reconciliation. A year later, almost to the day of that first devastating call, I received another one from my mother. "Rachel," she said, her voice bright, "the shop is hosting a small event next week. Nothing fancy, just a community thing. I'd love for you to come. Maybe bring one of your students from the workshops?" "I'd love that," I said. There was a pause, then she added, "I'm proud of you, you know." For a moment, I couldn't speak. All I could manage was a quiet, "I know, Mom." After we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, looking out at the city lights. I realized then that the story I'd been living wasn't one about rejection or revenge. It was about rebuilding, about the slow, deliberate work of turning pain into purpose. Elaine had once told me that our family's legacy was reputation. She was wrong. Our real legacy was resilience. And as I watched the lights flicker on the water, I knew that everything we'd lost had made space for something better. Respect that had been earned, love that had been chosen, and peace that finally, after all these years, felt like home. Looking back on Rachel Hayes' story, what began as a painful act of rejection became the very path that led her to freedom, purpose, and truth. Once disowned by her image-obsessed mother, Rachel's journey from exile to empowerment was not about revenge or proving her worth. It was about reclaiming her identity and rewriting what family meant. When the fragile facade of the Hayes family collapsed under the weight of pride and poor choices, it was Rachel, the daughter who had been silenced, who stepped forward to rebuild what had been lost. Through courage, discipline, and compassion, she transformed the ruins of deceit into a foundation of honesty. Her strength was not in wealth or success, but in her willingness to face the uncomfortable, to lead with integrity when others hid in denial. The deeper lesson in her story reminds us that strength often comes disguised as heartbreak. Sometimes the people who push us away are the very ones who need us most, and healing doesn't always begin with forgiveness. It begins with truth. Rachel's transformation teaches that respect can't be inherited or demanded. It must be earned through consistent actions, humility, and empathy. In today's world, where appearances still often outweigh authenticity, her journey challenges us to build lives rooted in integrity rather than image, to speak up, even when silence is easier, and to love without losing ourselves. Now let me ask you something. If you were in Rachel's place, what would you have done when your mother asked for help after cutting you off? A. Help her immediately because family deserves second chances. Wait until she acknowledges her mistakes before stepping in. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. And what about you? Do you think pride is ever worth losing family over? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can read and reflect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if this story touched you. It helps us bring you more meaningful, heartfelt stories like this one.